As a faith community, we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day not just as a time to think he was a great leader and accomplished so much. Instead, we also reflect on our relationship with race and how far we have to go to live in a just land. Many of you may not know that we have a diversity task force here at First Unitarian. It's a small group who has been studying systematic racism and white privilege for a couple years. Our goal is not to bring more people of color into the congregation, but to educate ourselves and our community to end racism and to end white privilege. This is not merely an educational model of learning facts, but it's soul work. If you would like to be part of this conversation in the next few months, you can start by please attending a discussion with our pulpit guest after the second service today, which will follow with a short and scrumptious lunch. You can also attend a screening of White Like Me in February, and we have also planned an anti-racism workshop in May. And if there's, within your order of service, there's an insert, and you can tear off the bottom and put your name and address and put that in the recycling boxes on your way out. That way we can update you with other information and other events that will come this spring. So to start off our conversation for our message today, I've asked Patrick Rodriguez to speak about his experience of race. Patrick is a member of this congregation and first attended it more than 10 years ago. You may not see him a lot because he's often in the back doing video and recording the services. He has worked as a professional writer for about a decade. And then following Patrick, I want to invite you to give a warm welcome to our pulpit guest for today, Professor Sonia Gibson Rankin, whom I've had the pleasure to meet and get to know over the past couple months. Professor Gibson Rankin, JD, serves as Associate Dean in the University College and is Lecturer of Africana Studies at the University of New Mexico. Her area of research is the law and its impact on Black American community. She is also an adjunct professor at the UNM School of Law, where she teaches race and the law. Professor Gibson Rankin loves being in the classroom, teaching classes like race, family, and law, and race in the digital age. Please welcome Professor Gibson Rankin. Before they both speak, I want to start out by reading a poem by Langston Hughes. It was written in 1951, and I think it still speaks to our current racial issues. The last lines in particular remind me of Ferguson, Baltimore, and Chicago, and other places that have been protesting police brutality against people of color. Harlem by Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?
It's pretty cool how education and a little bit of life experience can change someone's perspective on race, ethnicity, and culture. As a child, I was described as Mexican by family, friends, teachers, coaches, etc. I'm pretty sure this had something to do with my light brown complexion, indigenous features, and Spanish surname. But even then, I knew that such a classification was a bit odd. Although I spent my youth in suburban San Diego County, California, roughly about 50 miles from the US-Mexican border, and one of my grandparents, my maternal grandfather, was raised in Mexico, it felt so much more comfortable to call myself an American. After all, I watched mostly American television, listened to mostly American music, ate mostly American food, and I didn't read much. Plus, I didn't even speak Spanish. In college, however, I was down with being brown, or Mexican, or Latino, or Hispanic. You see, I attended an engineering school in Boston, where the student body was about 90% non-Hispanic white, to use the Census Bureau's definition, and where at times it seemed like I was the only student at the school with a Spanish surname. But the thing about Boston, unlike anywhere in Southern California, is that it's a walkable city and easily accessible through public transportation. So I got to see a lot of it in person. Boston is where I was introduced to other members of the Hispanic diaspora: Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Central Americans, South Americans, and discovered a fondness for tropical music, mostly salsa, merengue, cumbia, which was so much different from the Mexico region music that played in my grandparents' house, and foods from the Caribbean. So yeah, I was fine calling myself Mexican or whatever. I felt I had to represent mi gente. Something happened after college, though. I started reading books and attending academic lectures, ultimately pondering the definition of race, ethnicity, and culture. Race refers to a group of people identified as distinct from other groups due to supposed physical and genetic traits. Ethnicity refers to where someone came from. Culture refers to the beliefs and customs of a particular society. I no longer consider my culture, to be Mexican or Hispanic or Latino. To me, my culture consists of being around the people I love most and partaking in activities that fit naturally with my personality. That's my perspective of culture, of course, and each of you has your own. Nowadays, I identify ethnically as a Southern Californian who feels most at home in the land of enchantment. I don't know the first thing about me, Mexican, and describing myself as Mexican feels like an insult to those who grew up in that country. And in adulthood, I couldn't care less about race. Race, as I described it earlier, has no deterministic biological basis. In other words, it's a social construct. There's no such thing as a white person, a black person, a brown person, a yellow person, a red person, etc. There are only humans, and the cradle of humankind is in present-day South Africa because of many hominid fossils found there. Maybe I should call myself African. But that does not mean racism does not exist. You know, when the medical community links race to the health outcomes, it's really just using race as a substitute for other factors, such as genetics, environment, socioeconomics. However, the concept of race is important in our lives, and the racial categories to which we are socially assigned can determine real-life experiences, including the difference between life and death. But understanding that racial categories are made up, I hope one day can give us an important perspective on where racism came from and eradicate it. Thank you.
morning. You know, I want to thank Pastor Christine and James and Angela and Vance and the great people I've already had a chance to meet and talk with this morning. Let's give another applause for the Chalice Singers. Listen, you guys gather weekly to Precious Lord and Hush and U2 and, you know, this is kind of Sweet Honey on the Rock. Not everybody has this on a Sunday morning, so you guys should feel pretty good about what you've had. I want to really applaud you and this congregation for the work you're doing with James, and like he said, we've had a great time talking a lot over the last couple of months. We're only going to meet 20-minute meetings have gone considerably longer because there's so many things we've really enjoyed discussing. And in all honesty, after that fantastic few words by Patrick, I feel like you guys have already had a sermon. You might as well, you know, jump up and go. But if you wouldn't mind, I have a few things I'd like to share with you now. I'm a Jersey girl, so it means I talk fast. So bear with me. I'll kind of watch to see if I've left you. But I want to talk with you a little bit about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the work he did and the work we still have an opportunity to continue doing today on a conversation I'd like to call What Happens to a Dream Deferred. And that poem by Langston Hughes is so very critical into thinking about Dr. King's dream. For winter break, my family and I went to Washington, D.C. Now, actually, we did an East Coast blitz. We hit New Jersey, Maryland, D.C., back through Baltimore. We spent New Year's in Pittsburgh with the Whalers. I mean, we just hit everything on the East Coast. By the fourth day, my son said, "Is this another day we have to get up at 6 a.m.? I said, "No, today we'll get up at 7. I mean, we hit everything that could be seen. And on that journey, we went to Washington, D.C., where we had an opportunity as a family to visit the White House and the U.S. Capitol. And if you've ever been to D.C., you know, everybody talks about the cherry blossoms and everything, but there's nothing as an American icon as the White House at Christmas because of the work of decorations done. My daughter counted 32 Christmas trees. They say there's about 65 in the building. My Fitbit said I had 2 days worth of steps by the time we were done with Washington, D.C. And while the White House was awesome and awe-inspiring for so many reasons, I was fascinated with our journey to the U.S. Capitol. In particular, because the U.S. Capitol from 1810 to about 1860 housed the U.S. Supreme Court. And we entered in through the chambers where Chief Justice Marshall and Chief Justice Taney sat over so many pivotal cases. And I stood in the room where the Amistad decision was decided, where the Supreme Court justices heard oral arguments saying that these enslaved Africans who overthrew their ship were free men. I stood in the room where years later, a different gathering of that body heard oral arguments related to a young man named Dred Scott and could look him in the eye and determine that the Negro had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect. I stood in that space, and I couldn't move. And if I had more time in a different day, I'd tell you what it meant to be in that space, but my family's all techie people. They wanted to go do the Science Museum, so I didn't get to give it to them like I would have wanted to, but there's something unique about being there, and I plan to take them back, not only to talk more about what it meant to be in that space, but to stand on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. That's something every American should do, every person in this land should do, is stand on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, because behind you, you will see that awe-inspiring statue of President Abraham Lincoln. It's larger than life. It's larger than 10 lives. And not only that, on the walls are written his Gettysburg Address, but also his second inaugural address, where he talked about the fact that we're going to have to get through this Civil War until we cleanse the 250 years of blood, sweat, and toil that had been done. That's what he did. But when you look forward, you can imagine yourself in the space where Dr. King once stood. And you can imagine looking over the Washington Mall and seeing the people there, some in chairs, some with their feet in the reflecting pool, people in their Sunday finest on a Wednesday afternoon. It was a pleasant day by all DC accounts. It was about 63 to 83 degrees, no rain, and depending on if you came from the north or the south, that was a nice weather day. And, I can imagine what Dr. King felt. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're standing in front of 5 people or 500 or 5,000 or 250,000. When you're up speaking in front of people, it gets hot really, really quickly. And I imagine Dr. King thinking about his notes, and I imagine him looking at those words by President Abraham Lincoln at some point and thinking about it as he stood in this space and time. And you can also imagine what he felt like being last on the agenda. I mean, if you've ever been scheduled to speak before or after lunch or last on an agenda, people have one thing in mind: hurry up. Dr. King, the night before, sat with his colleagues and with his advisors, and they worked tirelessly on the words he should say as the last speaker of the day. They had about, quite a lengthy work done. In fact, it was completed, typed up, and distributed to all the media outlets so they would know what words Dr. King was going to say. And for the first 7 paragraphs, he read exactly from the page. And he got to about the 7th paragraph, and he had a pause. And in that pause, famed gospel singer Mahalia Jackson shouted out, "Tell them about your dream." And in the blink of an eye, in the span of a heartbeat, he left those notes. And that speech turned from something we've all heard to something that you felt. It turned from something that he said to something that has been reverberated throughout our lexicon today. It turned into what we call the "I have a dream" speech. And he gave words that he had delivered actually many times before in various forms, but on this scale, in this moment, it would change the national conscience. And in fact, many times people will refer to that as his greatest speech ever given. But what I want to talk to you about today is about the words he would say 5 years later. Because although he had a dream that day, he will continue talking about what happens when a dream is deferred. I thank James for that reading of Harlem by Langston Hughes, and I think about Langston Hughes writing that work. I mean, he will be hitting his heyday by the 1950s, although he would be known as a Harlem Renaissance poet. And he noted a disillusionment through Harlem born out of racial discrimination and the people who would return from World War II to see an America that would send them off to war but would not welcome them when they returned. He would know that in the South, people were returning and black men were being lynched while in their uniforms. He would return to this kind of America, and he would write a poem called Harlem. It'll be later known as Dream Deferred. And Langston Hughes would visit some family friends of his in Chicago, the Hansberry family. Lorraine Hansberry, a young girl who grew up with Langston Hughes sharing family dinners, would craft a play known as A Raisin in the Sun, drawn from that very poem. In fact, the poem and the play would be so tightly coupled that when the playbill would go out in New York City, it would have the poem listed inside of it. And this play would change America. It would run in Broadway for 538 consecutive performances. Nominated for 4 Tony Awards, it would win countless critic awards. 11 days after the play came out, they had already started optioning it for a movie. Some of you may remember various versions of it, starring Sidney Poitier, or having seen it played out in plays in small towns all across America. And when this play would strike such a visible space, it would be written about over 11 times in the New York Times in a few weeks. Dr. King read the New York Times every single day. And in 1959, he changed his sermon. It was Easter Sunday, and he's nearing Easter, Palm Sunday. You've got to have a theme, and he's working hard on a theme. And as he's reading the New York Times, many scholars are starting to see that he found a connection between this poem to this play to this change in his rhetoric. And he would move from talking about unfulfilled hopes to the dreams. This would be years before he would ever get up in front of the Washington Monument the Lincoln Memorial. And in fact, it would change a number of his written work because this dream deferred that Langston Hughes was talking about is really pretty critical. Now, what's this thing about dreams, right? And I encourage you over the next week to think about the dreams you have. Just in preparing for this, my dreams have gotten weird. That's how it always gets. The more you're thinking about dreams, the weirder your dreams get. And dreams are a collection of ideas and images that often are involuntary linked to a certain period of response. When you first drift off, your heart rate drops, slows down, your temperature drops, and your brain begins processing all the things of your days. It's funny because although it's been a long time since I've had to take an exam, every time it's finals time for my students, I start having a panic attack in my dreams about not being prepared for finals. At some point I tell myself, wait, you're grown. This is someone else's problem. But these things are all linked together, and in our dreams are actually helping you, right? The dreams are helping you process new information. This is why they encourage you to read something good for yourself before you go to bed. Watch something of use before you go to bed, because your brain is using that time to churn through all of that information and make it matter. Dreams help you understand your new experiences. Dreams help you prepare for a new change. Dreams help you cope with loss. This is why we often see some of our loved ones in our dreams. This is your body's way of processing those changes. And dreams also help you facilitate learning. And in this poem that Langston Hughes crafts, he talks about dreams. And it's so critical. It's one of the best pieces one should have, because it follows almost as if what we remember learning in our elementary school days about similes and metaphors, right? Everything is based off of a simile, some kind of connection to something else. But then that last stanza, it just says, or does it explode? And he gives no simile, he gives no metaphor, he gives no comparison, because it's almost richer that he gives us an opportunity to understand what that means in our own journeys. And this is why he gets to be the best playwright, poet ever. I mean, this is what they do, right? He knows that there's a distinction that can be made when you're allowed to see where those words matter in your journey. So then I think about Dr. King having to come to this understanding, having to hear these things, and what Langston Hughes was fighting when he thought about those veterans who would return and would be mistreated in their own land, what Lorraine Hansberry was trying to get across in this pivotal play, what Dr. King was trying to say in this I Have a Dream speech, is that there was this thing happening in America that despite our best efforts, despite our work to change the tenor of our conversations, we were in the same problems that we were yesterday. Every semester, I have my students, when I teach my race and the law, I teach about 50 students at the undergrad level on race and the law, and we do what is called the privilege walk. And all of the students stand out in the middle of campus at Zimmerman Plaza. I mean, many of you have seen it, right between the library and the humanities building, and they are required to line up side by side through the center of the plaza. And I say, I'm going to ask you a question, and depending on your answer, you're going to step forward or step back. How many of, if your family was brought to this country not under their own free will, take a step back? If you had someone in your house who cooked and cleaned for your family, take a step forward. If you've never been on an airplane, take a step back. If you've ever been discriminated against because of your race or age or sexual orientation or your journey, take a step back. And what happens is in this classroom of college students who all start side by side, by the end of about 40 questions, some have passed me and are already headed back towards a class, and some are so far away they can barely still hear my questions. Because of students, I've even modified it. I ask a question, how many of you have started, if you've started a 401k while in high school or college, take a step back, and you should see the looks on people's faces who don't even know what a 401k is. And we get back to the room, and I say, if you're all in the same space, how can we ever have a conversation about anything when some of you don't even know the words that other people have acted on? How do we have a shared journey? How can we solve things? It's always funny, right? It's been raining here and, there's snow and we always get very excited about it. But what happens in Congress when you're talking about water rights in some places where they're dealing with flooding and other places where it hasn't rained in months? Every now and then I'll tell my kids a story about New Jersey and snow up to your waist, and they're like, I can't even envision it. You see people who are in Florida who travel north and they put on jackets because it's a breezy 72. How do we get to have a shared conversation? How do we ever get to address these big things that stand in our journeys? When I teach from this idea of what I call Inception Pedagogy from that great scholar, Christopher Nolan, who also did Batman. All right, he's a movie guy. But the film Inception is everything everyone should see because it talks in particular about an idea that's so embedded in you, you can't even figure out where it came from. If I told you to think about an elephant, you're always going to think about an elephant because I told you to think about an elephant, and you'll know I'm the one who told you to think about an elephant. How do we get to that root, that nugget, that embedded thing that you've always had and can't even tell where it comes from, that you act on? This play we've all been required to step into. The biases that we all act upon. How do we unearth that very, very deep thing? James 2, verse 1 has this scripture, "My dear brothers and sisters, how can you claim to have faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ if you favor some people over others?" And I know we would all walk out and say, I don't favor anyone over others. I treat everyone the same. But using that Inception pedagogy, Malcolm Gladwell talks about this in his work, Blink. What is that thing within us that makes us have this visceral reaction before we even know why? Before we've even responded to it. And this is what Dr. King will get to, because what Dr. King is going to talk about is this fact that after he talks about the dream in 1963, after the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1965, Watts will burn. And the cities all across the United States will go up in flames. And this Southern boy is going to start to journey to see what's happening in the rest of the country. He'll say, I never found more racist crowds than when I got to Chicago. It was worse than he even was dealing with in the South, and it will change everything about Dr. King thinking about his dream. There was this belief that if we could just give everyone the right to vote, it would change the structure, if everyone had a free chance to get there. And in the North, they had been voting for decades and decades and decades, and problems had not changed. His rhetoric will change, his ideas will change, his arguments will change. And in fact, many people forget this, but the March on Washington was actually entitled the March on Washington for Freedom and Jobs. Employment, gainful employment, giving people a chance to work for what they get, giving people a chance to advance themselves in their own economic prosperity and opportunities. Dr. King will start to address the fact in 1967 that there are three evils in the American society that had not ever been addressed. Those three evils being racism, poverty, and militarism. And the more he said those words, the quieter the applause got. The more he focused on those key issues, the sizes and the responses of the crowd changed. That was Dr. King. That was him after he saw the world, after he got to a bigger space. And so what I want you to think about today as you go on and you think about Dr. King's dream, and in fact, he's going to define he'll go on to define a dream deferred quite critically. He's going to start to refer to it as I wanted to make sure I gave it to you because it was very good. Yes, he's going to start to talk about the dream deferred being this thing that's going to fester in the people. He's going to start incorporating he's going to talk about this explosion of a dream deferred. And so what can we actually do about this? What is actually required of us to think about when thinking about what Dr. King was really envisioning, what Langston Hughes meant? Well, we're going to think about these two major things that are still guiding many of our journeys. One of them being implicit bias. Those are those things within you, right? That hard things to turn off. But the bigger one, the harder one, will be the structural racialization that's around us. So what can you do? Well, you can spend some time really fighting yourself, really questioning your choices, really thinking critically. What books am I reading? Who are the authors of these books? And do the authors of the books I read look like me? For the next 3 months, I'm only going to read books that have to be translated to English. For the next 3 months, I'm only going to watch channels that are different than the ones I normally see. I'm going to invite someone new to my home. When we go out for lunch, I'm going to invite the person in the office that I spend most of my time avoiding. This is how we're going to see a bigger space around us. This is how we're going to change things. But the structures around us are going to be very hard to get through. In fact, Dr. King is going to say, for years I've labored with the idea of reforming the existing institutions of the South. A little change here, a little change there. Now I feel quite differently. I think you've got to have a reconstruction of an entire society, a revolution of values, the core things within us. I've always loved A Raisin in the Sun. In fact, it bothers me when I hear it described as the story of a shattered dreams of a Negro family. That's what they called it, and this is what many people have attached it to. But if you've seen A Raisin in the Sun, I mean, there's a critical line. I always tell it to my children. In my mother's house, there is still God. When, Bertha gets that slap across the face for coming out of her mouth. I mean, I share that with my kids. Watch this. Don't get too grown. But the end of that play shows that despite the fact that the family was going to a community that did not want them, that had been having bombings, that tried to pay them off to not integrate the community, they went. Despite the fact they had discord in the household and the son didn't know how to interact with others, they went. Despite the fact the daughter was searching for her religious experience and her understanding of herself, they went. They didn't let anyone stop them. They didn't let anyone get in the way of what they were looking to accomplish. I'm going to ask you to do me a favor over the next couple of months. As we think about Dr. King today and tomorrow, I'm going to ask you to not read the I Have a Dream speech. I'm going to ask you not to watch the video. I'm going to ask you to pick 3 other speeches he has done. I'm going to ask you to explore more of what he's shared and his ideas and his purpose. Just as Patrick said, race is not real, but racism is within our everyday journey. And we can do something about it because it was not just black people that worked to change it, and it was not just white people, whether we call it menudo or chitlins. Whether we're after sweet potato pie or pecan pie or pumpkin pie. There's this shared journey we're all under. It's going to take all of us. It's going to take all of our experiences. But I will leave you with this part of his talk he gave. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope, and this is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. And if America is to be a great nation, this must be true. I encourage you, as we reflect on Dr. King, and you're going to go to More Furniture and get that discount because I saw the commercial too, to do some bigger things when you think about Dr. King and his work and the work he has still left for us to do. I thank you very much for this opportunity and have a great day.
Please rise in body and or spirit and join with me in singing our closing hymn, which is When the Spirit Says Do.